In the middle of a brutal Montana winter, a retired Navy SEAL believed his life was already over. The war had taken his voice, his strength, and the last companion he loved. He swore he would never open his heart again. Then one night, through a blizzard that could kill in minutes, something scratched at his cabin door. What collapsed on his porch wasn't just a wounded white German shepherd. It was a soul that had been shot, abandoned, and left to die. When the law took the dog away, Jack did what he thought was right until the impossible happened. The dog escaped captivity, ran for miles through blood and snow, and returned home on torn paws, just to find the man who saved him. In that moment, Jack dropped to his knees and made a promise no law could break. I will never let them take you again. This is not just a rescue story. It's a story about loyalty stronger than fear and love that refuses to surrender. If this story moves you, please like, share, subscribe, and comment below where you're watching from. Your support helps keep these powerful stories alive. Winter held Montana the way an old hymn holds a church. Tight, echoing, and strangely comforting if a man didn't listen too closely to what it reminded him of. Jack lived where the pines grew tall enough to argue with the clouds, and the snow piled up like unfinished apologies. His cabin was small, stubborn, and warm, only because he kept feeding the stove as if it were a living thing that could starve. On the mantel sat a worn collar, the leather softened by years of loyal breathing. The name tag was dulled, but Jack could still trace the letters with his thumb, the way some men trace wedding rings after the house goes quiet. He didn't talk much anymore. His voice had been damaged long ago, and what remained came out rough as gravel. It wasn't just the throat. It was everything that followed the war home. Words were supposed to help people carry grief. For Jack, words only made it heavier. The forest at least didn't ask him to explain. It only asked him to endure. A month earlier, he had buried his last companion, an old military dog who had outlived every promise Jack ever made to himself. Jack had dug the hole in frozen ground the way he dug fighting positions overseas. Steady, efficient, no time wasted on feelings he couldn't afford. But afterward, when the shovel leaned against the tree and the wind blew snow into the fresh mound like a cruel kind of blessing, something inside him had split. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to let the cold in. Since then the cabin had felt too big, even though it was barely big enough for one man and his shadows. The silence pressed against his ears harder than gunfire ever had. Jack told himself he was done. Done rescuing. Done adopting. Done pretending he could outrun loss by collecting another set of paws to follow him around. The woods, he believed, were like the ocean. Beautiful, honest, and perfectly willing to take what you loved without even a moment of regret. He was too old to start over. He was too tired to bury another friend. And if there was any humor left in him, and there was, though it hid like a shy ember, he used it only on himself. Look at you, he rasped to his own reflection in the window some mornings. Tough guy in the mountains, scared of getting attached to a dog. The storm that night arrived like a myth. Not the gentle kind of story, but the ancient kind. Wind that sounded like wolves singing. Snow that erased trails and turned the world into one long blank page. The kind of weather that made a man feel small and made a cabin feel like a thin promise made of wood. Jack sat in his chair, mug of tea cooling in his hands, staring at the collar on the mantel as if it might speak for him. He pictured spring, moving to a town, to a quiet apartment, to a place where snow didn't bang at the walls like a debt collector. He could almost taste the relief of not having to fight the world for warmth. Then a sound threaded through the storm. Soft at first, a scratch, another. Jack's heart stumbled the way it used to when the radio crackled at midnight with a call he didn't want to answer, but had to. Wind, he told himself. Branch. He took a sip of tea and hated the way his hand trembled. The scratching came again, careful pleading, and then a thin, broken whimper that didn't belong to the wind or the trees. It belonged to something alive that knew it was losing an argument with the cold. Jack stood, knee protesting like an old teammate who never forgave him. He limped to the door, his palm rested on the latch. Logic said no animal would be stupid enough to come to a porch in a blizzard. Experience said desperation makes fools of all creatures, human and otherwise. He opened the door and the storm lunged at him, slapping snow into his face like icy confetti at the worst parade in history. He squinted into the white chaos. For a moment there was nothing, just swirling snow and darkness. Then the drift at the threshold moved. A small shape tumbled forward like the storm had dropped it there on purpose. Jack's breath caught. The night had delivered a visitor. And the cabin that would not forget had opened its door again. The thing that fell into Jack's cabin didn't march in like a hero. It didn't announce itself with dramatic timing. It simply collapsed, bone-tired, half-frozen, and too young to understand that pride is a luxury. Snow clung to its fur in tiny, hard crystals, and its body shook so violently that the wooden floor seemed to hum with it. Jack shoved the door closed with his shoulder, wrestling it shut against the wind. When the latch finally caught, the cabin returned to its familiar sounds. Stove crackling, teacup settling. Jack's own breathing, ragged, startled, suddenly too loud. He crouched, wincing as his knee barked. The animal was a puppy, or at least it looked like one at first glance. A small muzzle, ears folded back, paws too big for its body, like it had borrowed them from a future version of itself. But as Jack brushed away snow, he saw the telltale lines and sturdier build of a German shepherd, and not the typical sable coat. This one was white, a pale ghost of a dog, bright even in the cabin's dim firelight. Jack let out a rough sound that might have been a laugh if his throat had been kinder to him. "Of course," he rasped. "Of course you'd show up looking like a snowdrift with opinions." The puppy's eyes fluttered open. Not the wild glare Jack expected from a scared animal cornered by warmth. These eyes held fear, yes, but also a strange focus, as if the puppy had chosen this door the way a drowning man chooses air. The pup tried to lift its head and failed. It made a noise somewhere between a whine and a sigh, then went still again. Jack's training, old as it was, slid into place. Hypothermia, shock, dehydration. He'd seen men go quiet like this and never come back. He wouldn't watch it happen again. Not here, not on his floor. Jack moved with the calm of ritual. He fetched an old blanket, one he hadn't bothered to fold since grief had made chores feel pointless. He wrapped the puppy gently like he was bundling a candle flame. The pup shivered less with each minute near the stove. Jack warmed a bowl of water, testing it with the back of his hand. He remembered suddenly and sharply how he used to check the temperature of baby bottles when his sister's kids were small. An ordinary memory that landed in his chest like a soft punch. For a second, he hated that kindness could still sneak up on him. Then he hated himself for hating it. He lifted the puppy's lip to check its gums. Too pale. The pup was fighting hard, but it was losing. Jack found a dropper in a drawer left over from old dog medications and filled it with warm broth thinned with water. He eased the dropper to the pup's mouth. "Come on," he whispered, voice barely present, more breath than sound. "Do the heart part. I'll do the rest." At first, the pup didn't swallow. The liquid dribbled out, and Jack felt his stomach clench with frustration. The old helplessness that always rose when life refused to cooperate. But he didn't rush. He didn't force. He offered again and again. The pup's tongue finally twitched. One swallow, then another. The smallest victory in the world, and Jack felt it like a medal. As the puppy drank, Jack studied its body. Under the fur, the ribs were visible. The belly was hollow. The paws were raw from ice. And on the hind leg, hidden by snow-matted hair, was a smear of dark red. Jack's eyes narrowed. He peeled the fur back carefully and found a wound. Cleaned, not torn, not ragged, not a bite, not a trap scrape. Something else, something human. Jack's pulse slowed in a way that meant danger. He had learned long ago that monsters didn't always wear uniforms. Sometimes they wore weekend jackets and expensive boots and called violent sport. He looked at the trembling puppy and felt anger flare. Cold, controlled, familiar. The pup blinked up at him again, and in those eyes, Jack saw the oldest request in the world. "Please don't leave me." Jack swallowed hard. "All right," he rasped, trying for humor like a man lighting a match in darkness. "You picked the wrong porch if you wanted an easy life." He paused, then added softer. "But you picked the right one if you wanted to live." The storm raged outside like it had a personal grudge, but inside the cabin, Jack created a small kingdom of warmth. Stove fire, a blanket nest, and his own stubborn presence planted beside the puppy like a sentry. He cleaned the wound under the flicker of firelight, and the more he looked at it, the more it told him a story he didn't want to hear. The cut wasn't shredded the way claws and teeth would do. It was precise, fast, a graze from a bullet. Jack's throat tightened. He'd seen bullet wounds in 100 places in 100 men, and he could read them the way some folks read weather. This wasn't a hunting accident. This was someone aiming at something alive and small and deciding it didn't deserve mercy. He felt the old Navy SEAL inside him rise like a ghost of its own. Quiet, alert, dangerous in the way a calm ocean can be dangerous. He didn't need a war zone to recognize cruelty. The puppy flinched when he dabbed antiseptic. Jack used a bit of vodka because it was the only thing strong enough and clean enough. The pup wed once, then bit down on the blanket instead of biting him. That small act, choosing pain over aggression, shocked Jack more than the wound did. He'd met grown men who couldn't manage that kind of restraint. "Easy," Jack murmured, voice a rough scratch. Yeah, I know. I'm not your favorite right now." He tried a crooked smile, and for a moment he almost imagined the puppy rolling its eyes like, "Really? This guy thinks jokes help?" Then the pup's breathing steadied, and Jack's own chest eased a fraction, as if the cabin had taken a shared breath. He needed a name. Not because names made things official. Jack didn't want official. Official led to attachment. Attachment led to funerals. And Jack had filled enough invisible graveyards for one lifetime. But naming also meant recognition. It meant he wasn't just a dog or a problem. It meant somebody saw you. And Jack, for all his damage, still believed being seen could save a life. He looked at the puppy's coat, white as fresh snow, bright as moonlight on ice. The pup lay so still in the blanket, a pale shape near the fire, like a spirit that had wandered into the wrong world. Jack exhaled. "Ghost," he rasped. The word came out like a sigh and a promise at once. "Yeah, that's you. Don't get cocky about it." Ghost's eyes opened, amber and huge, and fixed on Jack's face. There was fear there, but beneath it something else, an odd steadiness, like the pup had decided Jack was the last fence between it and the dark. Jack felt a sting behind his eyes and hated it. Tears were inconvenient. Tears made a man remember too much. He blinked hard and busied himself with the bandage. All night, Jack remained close. When the stove popped, Ghost startled. When Jack shifted in his chair, Ghost relaxed. The pattern formed quickly. Fear then trust. Fear then trust. Jack knew that dance. He'd danced it with civilians in war zones, with his own body after injuries, with every piece of himself that had to learn to live. Again. At one point, Ghost tried to stand. The pup wobbled like a newborn deer and collapsed with a soft thump. Jack caught it before its head hit the floor and cradled it awkwardly, grumbling in his ruined voice. "Listen," he told the puppy. "I've carried heavier things than you, but none of them have looked at me like I'm the answer." He paused, the humor fading. "So don't make me regret opening that door." In the quiet hours before dawn, Jack's mind wandered to the old collar on the mantel, to the dog he'd lost, to the long months he'd spent pretending he could survive without needing anything. He remembered the last time he'd said goodbye, how his hand had rested on warm fur that was slowly cooling, and how the dog's eyes had been calm, forgiving, almost amused, like it was thinking, "You'll be okay, even if you don't believe it yet." Jack looked down at Ghost, curled in the blanket, breathing softly now. He realized the storm had delivered him a choice. Not a burden, a test, maybe. Not from God in the preachy sense, but from whatever quiet force keeps pushing wounded creatures toward one another until they finally stop running. Jack leaned back and stared into the fire. "All right," he whispered, barely audible even to himself. "You want a guardian? You got one." Outside, the blizzard howled. Inside, Jack and Ghost kept watch over the fragile, ridiculous miracle of survival. 3 days later, the storm loosened its grip the way a stubborn enemy finally backs off. Still dangerous, still watching but no longer trying to punch through the walls. The sun appeared in thin slices, pale and sharp, turning the snow fields into a kingdom of glass. Jack stepped outside with a pail of ashes and a limp that complained at every movement. Ghost, wrapped in an old scarf like a tiny offended prince, peered from the doorway. "Don't judge me," Jack rasped, catching the pup's expression. "You're the one who showed up half frozen. Fashion rules go out the window." Ghost's ears twitched, and for the first time Jack saw something that looked almost like curiosity. Not fear, not desperation. Curiosity was a luxury too. It meant the pup believed there would be a tomorrow worth noticing. Inside, routines formed. Jack warmed broth and mixed it with kibble softened into mush. Ghost ate like the world might steal the bowl mid-bite. Jack, who had spent years eating meals in a hurry, found himself laughing silently at the puppy's intensity. "Slow down," he told Ghost, though his own life had never been slow. "You're not in boot camp." Then, after a beat, he added, "Actually, you kind of are." Ghost healed quickly. The bandage came off, the wound sealed into a thin scar hidden under white fur. And as Ghost gained strength, the cabin gained noise, small skitters of claws on wood, an occasional crash when Ghost misjudged the distance between enthusiasm and physics. Jack pretended to be annoyed. He wasn't. He scolded the pup in his rough whisper as if he were a drill instructor. "No, absolutely not. That's a chair, not a mountain." But his eyes softened every time Ghost looked back. Tail thumping like mountain chair. Same thing. At night, Jack still felt the ache of loss. Grief didn't vanish just because a new set of paws entered the room. It simply moved around, making space and refusing to apologize for existing. Sometimes Jack woke from dreams, sand, heat, the sound of distant explosions, and found Ghost pressed against his leg, warm and steady. Jack would lie there staring at the ceiling beams and wonder if the dog's comfort was instinct or something more deliberate. Then he'd remember, love often looks like instinct from the outside. But peace never arrived without price. Jack noticed tracks near his property, snowmobile treads in a place where only deer and coyotes should have been. He told himself it was hikers, tourists, lost folks. Montana was full of people who thought wilderness was a theme park with better photo opportunities. Still, Jack's gut tightened the way it always did when something didn't fit. One afternoon, Ghost froze at the window, ears up, body stiff. Jack followed the pup's gaze and saw distant movement between the trees. A figure in bright gear, not hunting camo, too clean, too casual. The person didn't approach, just lingered long enough to look, then disappeared. Ghost gave a low sound, more vibration than bark, like a warning swallowed down. Jack ran his hand along Ghost's shoulder. "Yeah," he whispered. "I see it too." He hated how quickly the cabin had turned into a fortress again. Hated how easily he slipped back into readiness. He had wanted a quiet ending. But life apparently had other plans and a sense of humor that leaned dark. Despite the worry, tenderness kept arriving in small, almost ridiculous ways. Ghost learned that the old rug by the stove was sacred, Jack's no-shoes zone, except Jack didn't own shoes that weren't boots. Ghost learned that Jack's bad knee meant stairs were a slow negotiation. So, the puppy began waiting at the bottom, as if to escort him like a tiny white bodyguard. Jack learned that waking up to see a creature excited simply because he existed was a strange kind of medicine. One evening, Jack sat with the old collar in his hands. Ghost patted over and nudged Jack's wrist, then sat looking up expectantly. Jack raised a brow. "You want this?" he rasped. "It's older than both of us combined." Ghost tilted his head like a philosopher. Jack sighed and draped the collar over Ghost's neck for a moment. It was too big, slipping down like a comically oversized necklace. Ghost stood tall anyway, proud as if wearing a medal. Jack's chest tightened as he remembered his old dog, remembered the weight of loyalty. Remembered the way love keeps finding new forms even after it breaks. He removed the collar gently and returned it to the mantel. "Not yours," he whispered, voice barely there. Then after a pause, he looked at Ghost and added, "But you're something." Ghost leaned into Jack's leg and Jack, who had once sworn he'd never start over, rested his hand on that white fur, and let the quiet, strange miracle of companionship continue. The Davila arrived. It didn't come with sirens or helicopters. It came with a polite truck crunching up the snowy drive and a man in a uniform stepping out like he was delivering a package, which in a way he was, just not the kind Jack wanted. The ranger introduced himself as Mark, mid-40s, earnest face, the kind of guy who probably owned a golden retriever and believed rules could keep the universe tidy. He carried a clipboard and that practiced calm voice people use when they're about to ruin someone's day, but would rather not be yelled at for it. Jack stood in the doorway, shoulders squared, expression unreadable. Ghost hovered behind Jack's legs, peeking out like a white shadow, unsure whether to vanish or stand its ground. "Mr. Turner?" Mark asked. Jack nodded once. Mark glanced at Ghost and his eyebrows lifted. "That's a white shepherd." Jack's throat gave him only gravel.
Yeah.
Mark cleared his throat. "We've had reports, tracks, a dog matching that description. There's concern. Wildlife, livestock, public safety." He said it gently, but the meaning landed like a boot on Jack's chest. "Also, I'm obligated to ask about the injury." "That looks like a bullet," Jack rasped. The word came out sharp. Mark's face shifted from official to uneasy. Jack didn't invite him inside. He didn't need to. Cold air made conversations shorter. Mark explained the rules. Unregistered animals with gunshot wounds had to be reported. Dogs in remote areas without vet records were considered a risk. If Ghost was involved in an incident, Jack would be liable. If Ghost was deemed dangerous,